So it turns out that I'm a watch snob. See, towards the start of the year, when the channel was considerably smaller, I made a video asking where are the affordable mechanical chronographs. There's a gap in the market, after all, for an affordable-ish mechanical watch, perhaps priced a little higher than a PRX, that is a chronograph. I think it would do incredibly well. The Moonswatch proved that there is, after all, a market for this complication at a lesser price point. But in that video, I looked at vintage pieces on eBay, I looked at the microbrands, the big Swiss names, and quite frankly, there was nothing that really took my fancy. But the comment section pointed out this watch to me, the Seagull 1963, a watch that I forgot. And I think that was because I might be a watch snob. So today, let's talk about the Seagull 1963 and pick apart what being a watch snob is really all about. Welcome to Doug's Watches, the thinking watch channel. Here I like to talk about art, design, history, theory, and philosophy, and how they all relate to the world of watches. And if that sounds good to you, do make sure to like and subscribe. Okay, so snobbery. Now, snobbery is defined as the character or quality of being a snob. And a snob is a person with an exaggerated respect for high social position or wealth who seeks to be associated with social superiors and looks down on those regarded as socially inferior. Well, I quite frankly think the watch world is built on snobbery, at least in the highly marketed elitist version of it that we exist in today. So mechanical watches, they look down on quartz, gold looks down on steel, and Rolex, they quite frankly look down at everyone. And as I touched on in my video looking at nationalism in watches, Swiss made often looks down on Asian watchmaking. See, without really meaning to, at times I fall into this snobbery, and I think that's happened when it came to chronographs in that sub £1,000 price point. I'm drawn to these Braun Mecha Quartz curiosities because they're different, vintage Omega Chronostops because they're the I'm not like other guys Speedmaster, and Studio Underdog watches because they're just fun, wacky, and of course there's an element of FOMO as well. And while considering these watches, I wasn't considering this Seagull, even though it is an affordable mechanical chronograph. I knew it existed, but quite frankly, it slipped my mind. But why was that? Well, I think it's my internalized snobbery. Even though I like to take a critical, somewhat objective view on the watch world, I'm not immune to marketing. I'm not immune to hype-driven trends on YouTube and Instagram, and I'm not just purely rational. None of us are. And that means that as accepting as I am, there is a small part of me that because I've grown up in the lineage of European and Swiss watchmaking, I for some reason don't value those watches coming out of Asia, perhaps as much as I should. Be that Grand Seiko, San Martin, or watches from Seagull. So why do we look down on a watch then? Now, when discussing snobbery in watches, I think that's a very important question. And to answer it, I think we need to ask why we pedestalise certain watches over others. First, there's brand, so the notion that wearing a watch from Omega or Rolex makes us feel a certain way, that projects a certain image. Then there's history. So maybe a watch or brand achieved something significant or important, say the first automatic chronograph or even the first wristwatch. You can also take a look at where a watch comes from. Swiss made is intended as a marker of something being better than the competition now. We also have the watch itself. A watch could be put on a pedestal because of its value, for money, or its finishing. There are tons of things we could pedestalize a watch for as well. Do put them in the comments below. However, I think in picking out the Braun Omega Chronostop and the Studio Underdog chronograph, I fell into these traps, and as a result conveniently forgot about this Seagull chronograph through my snobbery. I simply didn't value its story, brand, or the watch itself. And who knows, maybe I discounted it because it wasn't Swiss or German, but instead Chinese. Who knows what is lurking beneath in our subconscious. However, Seagull, well, they are a brand. Their website might not be that aesthetic, and you might have Chinese script on the dial, but they have history. They have a full model lineup, and if simply being expensive is what it takes to make a great brand, well, they've got some expensive watches out there. If you've not come across it before, Grand Seagull is the Chinese answer to FP Journe and Breguet, and I would love to spend some time with these watches. But that might not be enough for you. However, the Seagull 1963 chronograph does have a story. In 1961, China's Ministry of Light Industry set the challenge of building the country's first chronograph. This was called Project 304 and took 2 years to produce. Launching for Chinese pilots in 1963, and thus later in its life, the watch would gain the 1963 name from the online watch community. This piece, quite frankly, has a history. So from where I'm sat, this has the non-watch related reasons for why we pedestalize certain watches over others. And yet I still ignored this. and you might expect it then to fall down on the final hurdle of being a good watch. Now, this is not one of those original watches, but instead a limited edition reissue that marked the 60th anniversary of the watch. This particular example is the 38mm, so smaller than the normal one, and it features a lug-to-lug of 47mm. So this wears a little larger than a 38mm probably ought to. And it is worth noting that it is quite close to the 42mm in terms of size in reality. The 42mm features a 48mm lug-to-lug, so the difference is quite marginal. Yet the 38mm watch, with its 18mm lug width and consequently narrow strap by modern proportions, it retains a vintage feel. It's 14.3mm tall. Now, I do wear a Tudor Black Bay GMT most days alongside a G-Shock 5600, so I'm used to wearing a tall and thick watch. However, this doesn't appear too tall, largely due to the domed sapphire crystal. This taper does shave a few millimetres off in terms of wearability. A few millimetres that I did only end up adding back on by switching the watch from its leather strap to a NATO one. Now, neither of these straps are particularly high quality. The leather strap is that sort that will crease somewhat easily. If you've had a Hamilton, think that. But then under £1,000, what strap-based watches have examples better than this? Quite frankly, I would struggle to name one. However, if you're considering buying one of these, I'm sure you're the type of watch owner that'll have a strap or two lying around that'll fit one of these, and if you don't, I'm sure you're itching at the chance to get one. Now the pushers, they feel pretty sturdy. Not as sturdy as that of a Daytona or Speedmaster, but not flimsy either. Potentially some larger hands may find them a little hard to operate, but then that's going to be the same with any vintage-sized chronograph. Now, you have a sapphire caseback, and the ST1901 isn't the most beautiful movement, but it's nice to see and pretty good looking. There are some nice finishing touches for sure, with some machine finishing appearing to emulate a little bit of pearlage. I believe this movement is based on an old Swiss one as well, the Venus Caliber 175, so potentially we can give it some more points for that. If we turn to the dial, at 9 o'clock we have a running seconds subdial, and at 3 o'clock a minutes elapsed one linked to the chronograph. It's undeniably a chronograph, but it's different to a Speedmaster and different to the often seen Panda chronograph that we get based on the VK movements. The only thing that doesn't quite sit well with me, blue hands. It was a bit of a shock getting it out of the box, and when the light caught the dial at first glance, they did jar with the red chronograph hand, but it occurred to me, in the absence of lume, when it's a little dark, stood against the pale champagne dial, it does remain remarkably legible. So why isn't this watch lauded? Well, I think it's a simple answer really. Seagull's 1963 ticks the boxes to be a greatly admired watch, and in some parts of the watch community it is, but in the mainstream it is not. And that's because to become a revered item of snobbery in the watch world, there's one final thing: a marketing budget. The names in the watch world that are markers of success and objects of cultural capital in the mainstream, so Rolex, Omega, Cartier, Richard Mille, Patek Philippe, they've all had major marketing budgets, film spots, marketing pieces, and celebrity ambassadors. And that helps build a watch's mystique and propel it through the stratas of society. But that all comes at a price, one that you as the end consumer would have to pay for. When you buy an Omega Speedmaster, you're funding the relationship with Daniel Craig, George Clooney, and Cindy Crawford on top of the watch you're actually getting. And that's why pieces like this Seagull, alongside many other Asian and micro brands, can offer what appears to be pretty darn good value. Now then, I must turn to pricing, and that means we must discuss the competition. Probably one of the most important things when it comes to affordable-ish watches is, of course, competition. The competition at this end of the market is incredibly strong. So this watch can be had for about $700 or about £550. Slightly more expensive than a usual 1963 chronograph, but then this is a supposed limited edition watch, so you're paying a bit of a premium for that. And at £550 though, there is a lot of competition in the mechanical chronograph space. Now you could go vintage, so a Tag Heuer 2000 automatic chronograph or an Omega Chronostop if you're a shrewd negotiator. Potentially even something based on the Valjoux 7750 movement, like a Hamilton Jazzmaster, a Khaki King, or an Officer chronograph. But I think the real competition for this watch comes from itself, and that's for two reasons. Now the ST1901 movement, sat beneath the caseback, well, that's where a lot of this competition comes from. This movement is the default off-the-shelf budget chronograph movement. The Studio Underdog Series 01 prices a comparable £550, while that uses the same base movement. And having recently been hands-on with them at the Manchester Watch Show, the Studio Underdog and this are comparably built, only that one perhaps is a little thinner with its flatter sapphire. But that being said, if you go to AliExpress and even to Amazon, there are other ST1901 watches that cost half, if not a quarter of this, and they often look the same. But do they have the same quality control and, quite frankly, polished and premium look? I'm not sure, and from what I can tell online, the official Seagull watches do cost more, yes, but they just might be that cut above. Seagull made a rod for their own backs by licensing out the production of their watch to third parties, and I think this has undermined mine and others' views of this watch. Because in comparison to that Studio Underdog, forgetting about the other Seagull style watches, I should have got excited about this on paper, and I should have always been interested in it, but I wasn't, and that's on me and my snobbery. Now then, wrapping up my thoughts. If you've seen one of my more recent watch review-ish videos, you'll have come across my semi-objective way of ranking watches, the Aura system, where I rank watches on 4 categories that are loosely grounded in philosophy, and I think take into consideration a holistic view of what makes a good watch, if not a great one. Aestheticism, the beauty and design of a watch. Utility, the value for money aspect. Romanticism, that's measuring that intangible feeling you get from a watch. And last, authenticity. Is the watch lying to us? Is it honest about what it is? Well, first then, aestheticism. I'm saying 7 out of 10. It's nice to look at the dial markings, be they the Arabic numerals, second markers, or indices. It's well balanced. But I can't give it a perfect score. I think the lugs are a little too long given the 38mm case size, and the blue hands, while functional, they don't quite sit right with me. Utility, 8 out of 10 again. To have a well-made mechanical chronograph at this price point is superb, but it could be thinner, and other watches with this movement and at this price point are, so not perfect marks. Romanticism though, 7 out of 10. Now value for money watches usually fall down here. These watches can often be at more attainable price points simply because there hasn't been so much marketing bloat fleshing out their stories. And as a result, this watch loses a couple of points here. However, to have an affordably priced mechanical chronograph I think is a fun novelty, and that pulls this watch's score up a bit. But with all that being said, wearing this has been fun. It scratches a similar itch to that of my Seiko 5, that sort of rugged, outdoorsy style. And because that's not really me, it gets some points back here as well for that added bit of fantasy. Now then, authenticity. I'm in two minds here. On the one hand, the mandarin on the dial, well, we could take that as authenticity, or you could take it as a watch leaning into its origins in a way that's a bit too heavy-handed, so 5 out of 10. Right then, that gives us a total of 27 out of 40, which puts it just ahead of some of the other iconic-ish affordable category watches I've had on the channel. So it's a decent watch, and it does live up to the hyped status within the watch community. The official, not so hot Doug's watches take there. So who should actually be buying these? Basically, as far as I see it, if you want a chronograph watch with a vintage edge, but don't actually want to buy a vintage watch, or say you want a chronograph but without the Instagram style hype, something, say, more traditional, then this Seagull is likely worth considering. As ever, thanks for watching. If you like my channel and want to support my work, do consider becoming a channel member. It helps me out just that little bit, and you get an extra video a month alongside a few other perks. If not, do like and subscribe before you go, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.